Sometimes fights are so one-sided you feel like you're watching Mike Tyson punch on with a toddler. These are the top 10 most one-sided beatdowns in UFC history. Starting with number 10. Crazy mountain Russian guy versus drunk Irish dude. As much as McGregor fans would like to lie to themselves and say that this fight was more even, Khabib was absolutely mauling Conor McGregor in this 4-round affair. At the start of this fight, it was actually surprisingly even, with McGregor stuffing a fair amount of takedowns. But Conor couldn't stop that good old-fashioned Dagestani wrestling, and as this fight went on, it became a one-sided beatdown. Like most people in the UFC, Conor couldn't stop the endless onslaught from this Dagestani wrestling. He was constantly getting pinned down in the fence and getting rained down on by the heaviest hits. The third round really shocked people because they actually stood in front of each other and striked for an entire round, and this is the only round that Khabib ever officially lost in his UFC career. People still to this very day debate whether or not Conor actually won a round in this fight, but it doesn't really matter because in the very next round he got choked out. These Russians, man. Number 9. Ryan Spann versus John Jones' son Dominic Reyes. After losing to John Jones in one of the most controversial decisions in UFC history, Dominic Reyes' career plummeted off of a cliff. He lost 3 straight fights by knockout, with the final fight being the most brutal, devastating KO of his career so far, and he hasn't fought since.
Oh my goodness, that was nasty.
Coming in at number 8 is Jorge Masvidal versus Nate Diaz. People argued that this fight was pretty back and forth, but honestly there was a lot of one-way traffic, with Jorge Masvidal's devastating striking dropping Nate Diaz a couple of times in one round. Nate Diaz was able to withstand most of the punishment due to his outrageous smoking abilities, but that didn't stop a cut from opening above his eye, which led to a doctor stoppage. A pretty anticlimactic result if you ask me.
The doctor's waving it off.
No way. What?
Wow.
The fight was picking up a bit before it ended, but I guess we'll never know. Coming in at number 7 is Arnold Allen versus Dan Hooker. Dan Hooker was losing a couple of fights and decided to drop back down to featherweight. His first fight on his big return to featherweight was against contender Arnold Allen. Arnold Allen was unleashing Mortal Kombat combos on Dan Hooker's face, and this is one of the craziest sequences in any fight ever. Man was throwing punches like my dad after 9 beers. After a relentless assault, Dan Hooker was knocked out with a standing TKO.
Bearing up the weapons. He's done it. It's the biggest win of his career!
Number 6. Bo Nickel versus Jamie Pickett. The UFC really wants to build Bo Nickel's star, so in his third fight in the UFC, they decided to give him a tomato can in Jamie Pickett. As you'd expect, Bo Nickel absolutely punched the hell out of Jamie Pickett. This was Jamie Pickett's first and more than likely last fight in the UFC. Wouldn't it suck being a professional fighter and getting fed to an up-and-coming contender? Tough times, man. Coming in at number 5 is Khamzat versus McCree. This is another entry with that good old-fashioned Dagestani wrestling. Khamzat was looking like a promising up-and-coming contender and has been tearing through the UFC lately, and he fought someone early on in his career that he would ragdoll all over the octagon. This is one of the most statistically one-sided fights in UFC history, with Khamzat landing over 100 strikes to McCree's 1. Khamzat slaughtered his opponent and was able to ground and pound him for a finish, ragdolling him all over the octagon. This fight could honestly be number 1 on the list, but the reason why it isn't any higher is because this opponent just wasn't very high level. Coming in at number 4 is Justin Gaethje vs Tony Ferguson. Yep, prepare to cry. Prime Tony Ferguson was one of the scariest fighters in UFC history and a guy that was pretty avoided in his prime. This was the start of the brutal decline of Tony Ferguson and a fight that breaks a lot of people's hearts, including mine.
Final minute of round 3.
Oh, nice. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. It's not. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness.
But outside of that, I don't see how we could have given him one.
No, I don't think so either. And he's getting punished. Look at that. Oh my goodness.
Before the second round was about to end, Tony Ferguson dropped Justin Gaethje with an uppercut. If this fight had like 10 more seconds, we would be talking about a completely different career turn for Tony Ferguson. Bloodied and bruised, and eventually finished in the final round. Number 3. Chael Sonnen versus Anderson Silva. Anderson Silva was on a historic run in the UFC, smashing every single contender in sight, dropping people left and right. But then came along a bad guy known as Chael Sonnen, who rocked the champion and was ragdolling him across the octagon for 5 whole rounds. Chael Sonnen, the MMA GOAT, was the only person to truly bring the fight to Anderson Silva in his prime, ragdolling the champion and ground and pounding him for most of their bout. In the final round of their fight, Anderson Silva would throw up a triangle choke, and this didn't work, and Chael Sonnen won the belt, and that was how it happened. Chael Sonnen was the new middleweight champion. I'm not arguing with anybody. Coming in at number 2, Max Holloway vs Brian Ortega. I mean, come on, what else is there to say about this fight? You knew this was going to be on the list. If you've made it this far, more than likely you knew that this fight was going to appear somewhere. Yeah, so anyway, Max Holloway landed like 10,000 punches on Brian Ortega's face. Brian Ortega was basically the human equivalent of a punching bag in this fight, and he was the most one-sided beatdown possibly ever. Brian Ortega was getting lit up like a goddamn Christmas tree in this fight, and by the very end he looked like a bloody mess. How this fight didn't get stopped earlier is just a testament to Brian Ortega's heart. The fact that he got hit over 400 times in a single fight is one of the craziest stats ever. Brian Ortega's corner stopped the fight in the 4th round, and Max Holloway was declared the winner, which is good because he probably would have died if this went on any longer. And coming in at first place is John Jones versus literally anyone. He absolutely pumped Mauricio Shogun Rua to win the belt at 21 years old to become the youngest champion in UFC history. He then beat up and choked out Quinton Rampage Jackson in his first title defense. And despite getting hit a couple of times by Lyoto Machida, he also choked his lights out with a standing guillotine. And who could forget the time he punched the lights out of Alexander Gustafsson? This was brutal. John Jones in his prime could beat nearly anyone in the UFC, except Chael Sonnen though.